Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. Puddles and I are here in Delavan, Wisconsin, with a very special guest, John Stevens. John.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you. It's been, I think, 16 years since we last saw each other.
Wow.
I think when Symphonia was down in Brevard, North Carolina, the Brevard Music Center.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
But we've had many communications
Yep.
since that point in time, and recently, I didn't know this at the time, but recently I became aware that you studied with Mr. Jacobs, so got in touch with you, and you're very kind to come down from Madison to Delavan, and Puddles and I came up from Chicago, so it's a nice midway point.
Great.
So thanks so much. Now, what was your involvement with Mr. Jacobs? When did you first become aware of that sort of thing?
Well, I did my undergraduate work at the Eastman School of Music. And when I started there, I wouldn't have been able to tell you who Arnold Jacobs was. By the time I graduated, of course, I was very aware of him as the famous tubist in the Chicago Symphony and had heard him on recordings and stuff, but I had never met him or anything. The summer before my senior year was my second year as a student at Chautauqua. And the first year I had studied with Chester Roberts, but Chester did not return, and they hired a new tuba teacher, and it turned out to be Toby Hanks. And I think really after my first lesson with Toby, I knew that that's who I wanted to work with in graduate school. And part of that was Toby was very much a disciple of Arnold Jacobs, had studied with him somewhat extensively. I know you interviewed Toby as part of this project, and I began to sort of get the general concepts of Arnold Jacobs' teaching through Toby. I went on and did my master's with him at Yale, with Toby at Yale, and I know a lot of course, he had his own spin on things, but a lot of what I learned from Toby, which was a lot. He was a wonderful teacher and mentor, and still a very close friend. A lot of it came from Arnold Jacobs' teaching, of course.
Right.
I did not meet Arnold Jacobs until after I finished my graduate work. I went to New York and freelanced for many years. And when visiting orchestras would come to town to perform at Carnegie Hall or wherever they played, particularly if it was Chicago or Cleveland, the low brass players would often go out after the concert to a place called Mulligan's Bar, which was right near Carnegie Hall. Very much a kind of a dive, good beer and good pastrami sandwiches and that kind of thing, but not a fancy place at all. But they had a big back room, and usually it wasn't very crowded, especially at that time of night. So I first met Arnold Jacobs in the back room of Mulligan's Bar. And these would have been in gatherings where, Toby would go, and I would go with him. Maybe one or two of the other younger guys would go. And it was a wonderful way to get to know him first, because it wasn't in a student-teacher relationship or really a professional relationship at all. It was just sitting over a few beers and a sandwich and talking, and very much a sort of off-the-record kind of situation where, the people that were there weren't afraid to tell a few ribald jokes and a few funny stories about the conductor and that kind of thing. So it was a great personal way to meet and get to know.
What were your impressions of him during that initial
social
meeting?
As you know, he was a very imposing person, and I mean that in the best way possible. He had a presence about him as a player and a musician, but also as a person.
Yeah.
I think with all young tuba players, meeting somebody like Jake for the first time was sort of awe-inspiring. But the nice thing about these get-togethers is that very quickly you began to know him as a great guy who put his pants on one leg at a time, just like you did, and I think that was an important personal education, if you will, to begin to realize that the really famous guys were still orchestral tuba players and really
just people.
Great, just people, great fellows. So I lived in New York for about 6 years and would occasionally see him there. And then I moved to Miami for 4 years and really didn't have any contact at all. But of course, I was aware of what he was doing professionally and everything, and became more and more aware. As I became a university professor of low brass myself, I became, of course, I was very aware of his teaching principles, but I became more aware of them as I would meet other colleagues and talk to many people, you know, who had studied with him and were very aware of him as sort of being at the pinnacle of our low brass teaching. Now, of course, in his private teaching career, he worked with singers and woodwind players and lots of people beyond low brass, but I think the root of what he did as a teacher was still very much with the tuba and low brass instruments in general. When I got to UW-Madison, I came there in 1985, and I think it's very typical of university professors, and you would have some awareness of this,
sure,
that when you're primarily teaching, you sort of, as I always put it, you become a teacher who plays rather than a player who teaches. You can start to suffer from some ills in your own playing, I think, through analysis, over-analysis, and that kind of thing. And I'm expecting that happened to me a little bit in the late 80s. And I remember thinking at the time, Arnold Jacobs is a 3-hour drive down the road. I really should go take a lesson with him. And so I did. I went down and had a wonderful experience. And then over the next few years, as I was struggling with various issues with my playing, I would go down from time to time. I only probably had a handful of lessons with him, but they were crucial experiences, as I think most anybody who ever studied with him would have said. So what did I take away from my lessons with Arnold Jacobs that applied to not only my own playing and my own personal issues, but very much to my own teaching? Like many young players, I started out sort of with the belief that if you worked on the nuts and bolts of what you did as a player of the tuba, if you worked on your technique, if you had your warm-up and your daily routine and worked on all the basics and fundamentals, the better you got at that, the better musician you would become. I think the most important overriding thing I learned through Toby to some degree, but directly from Arnold Jacobs also, was the notion that it really works the other way around. That you start with the product. What do you want to say? What do you want to be able to do on your instrument? And the technique and the ability to create that product follows along behind that. But that the product is the impetus. I think there used to be, among many, a misconception about Arnold Jacobs that would arise when you walked into his studio on Michigan Avenue. Sure. It was like walking into the lair of a mad scientist, in a way, or a doctor, or a combination of the two. His knowledge of anatomy, of course, was almost like somebody coming out of medical school, and all of his breathing devices and apparatuses that he had in his studio, that was what people became aware of, and I'm afraid what happened is that they saw him as this mad scientist who applied his science and his medical knowledge to playing a musical instrument. And I think that was exactly incorrect. My perception of him as a teacher was that every single thing that he did was acting towards the notion of being a better musician. And being a better musician entailed being a better player. Now, certainly you would work on specific concepts if you were struggling with something, right. But it was all about music with him all the time. Regarding those specifics that you might be struggling with, I think one of the most important things I learned from him was he would constantly be saying, don't try to fix the problem. Essentially replace the problem with something else. Because if you start working away and hammering away at something that you don't do well, he believed, rightly so in my opinion, that you were going to get very good at not doing it well.
Yeah, pretty much.
And his notion that you had to sort of look over here and A isn't working, so try B. or C or D or whatever it took. I think that was a hugely important concept to me as a player and certainly over the years as a teacher. Interestingly enough, as I think back about the lessons that I took with Arnold Jacobs, the one comment that he made, though, beyond these issues that we've already talked about, that stands out the most is I went in probably when I was really struggling with something. I don't even remember what the specific issue was. But I played for him for a while, and he stopped me at one point and he said, "You know, you're not having any fun playing." And he was absolutely right. Of course, I was struggling. I was working. As you know, we use the term play music. We never say work music. Well, when we have an issue with our own playing, I think we definitely start to overwork and not play enough. And he, with that one simple sentence, and this is now probably 30 years ago, that has stayed with me, and I've thought about it virtually every day of my life as a musician.
Wow.
You know, we have to enjoy what we're doing, and that we do it better if we enjoy it. So all of these concepts put together basically taught me to keep what I was doing as a player and a teacher in a certain perspective, and have that product, that musical product, the phrasing, the story, the picture, what you were trying to say as a player, which of course he did so beautifully, really be at the top of the ladder, and everything that you did led up to that. I should mention, actually, since we're talking about this, that in a way, some of the most important lessons that I learned from him, I learned before I ever even met him, and that was by listening to him play on recordings, but even more especially live with the orchestra. He had such an incredible, of course, not only musical ability, but an incredible sound that to me, the wonder of it is that I never heard him overbalance the orchestra or the section in any way ever, always completely tasteful and appropriate, and yet you could hear every note he played as if he was all by himself. It was a wonderful characteristic of his sound as a player, and when he would speak with you, you got that same clarity from not only what he said, but how he said it. I always felt like he was even just speaking to you in a conversational voice, he was being a great example of what he wanted you to do as a player and a musician.
Ned, you've just unpacked so many things. As you learn the music, you learn the instrument, with regard to more or less top-down motivation rather than bottom-up, and then the brain works on percentages, in terms of don't do what you don't want to do, but do what you want to do, replace the poor habit with a new habit.
Look at it positively.
Look at it positively, And then just the whole musical, be a musician first, not a tuba player. Be an artist who plays the tuba, not a tuba player.
Exactly. A musician who's the tool that we use is the tuba. It's a means rather than an end. And I learned that from him. That really completely flipped my approach to teaching, not to mention my own playing, around for the rest of my career.
And I mean that's pretty amazing. You had such a tremendously impactful career as a teacher. I mean, your students are out there impacting the world.
Well, I'm very fortunate to have met and worked with so many wonderful people, first of all, who happen to be terrific musicians and players and eager students who wanted to learn and get better. And so I fell, after years of playing primarily, I fell into the career that I think was right for me. And then I was able to diversify from that into composing and administration and conducting and a lot of things that have just made for a wonderful life as a musician.
Yeah, that's great. John, you described the bottom up approach that we encounter with so many students in terms of it's about the doing, not about the communication. It's something I call box checking. You know, we have students who,
Sure.
who if I do my 10 minutes of breathing, my 5 minutes of buzzing, my 15 minutes of etudes, my 20 minutes of this or that, you know, then all's good, and I'm going to be great. And it's more about the box checking than it is about the performing or the artistry, the communicating. You know, have you experienced that sort of thing?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I feel like with brass players, we're perhaps a little more oriented that way. Whereas, for example, a violinist or a pianist learns relatively early on that while they have to use what's on the page as a guideline, they're creating a performance of a piece of music, and they need to develop the artistic skills to go beyond that. Yeah, I think too often we take a means and make it an end, if you will. The way I've always liked to describe it to my students is that there's a craft to what we do and there's an art to what we do. If you were a carpenter, for example, you wouldn't want to be known as somebody who's a really good nail hammerer or somebody who can really saw a board with the best of them.
Yeah.
It's about how you use those skills and the tools that you have in order to create something. Music is exactly the same way to me. So while it's very good to work on your craft and establish the fundamentals and the basics of your playing, look, it still comes down to the most important things about what we do are playing with a really terrific, beautiful, wonderful, strong sound, playing with great rhythmic integrity, playing accurately, playing in tune with ourselves and with others. All stuff that we need to work on. But the way to improve those things is not just to aim at those things and then stop there. I think the way to improve those things is to make music, to phrase, to tell a story, paint a picture, have direction and energy and motion and emotion to what you're doing as a player. Then all of those fundamental things will improve because they have to in order to do and say what you want to do as a musician. This is hugely important to me. I would much rather be known as an excellent musician who happens to play the tuba than an excellent tuba player.
Right.
One of the things that I always told my students was, when you play a recital, and inevitably people come backstage to congratulate you afterwards, if they come back and say, hey, that was really good playing, that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But if they come back and say, wow, that was a really terrific piece of music, then you've really done something. You've done your job. I think all of us who make music, particularly at a high professional level, we're still there to serve that music. You know, to take, and maybe this is because I'm a composer. I have found over the years that as a composer I tend to think like a performer, and as a performer I think like a composer. They go hand in hand. Somebody creates a piece of music. Essentially, a performance of that piece is a collaboration between you and the composer to say something meaningful. Sometimes it's joyous, sometimes it's sad, sometimes it's pretty, sometimes it's ugly, purposely. But it's got to be meaningful in some way.
Yeah, and I think this is really at the root, as you mentioned earlier, of what Jacobs was all about. He was all about the message. He was all about you affecting the audience in some way, and he was always quick to point out the audience doesn't care if your lip hurts. It doesn't care if you feel good or bad that day. They don't care about those things. They're there just to have a good time.
Right.
And so you have to get past how your lip feels or how you're feeling generally and lie to them in some cases.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he had an incredible ability that I have to admit everybody doesn't have, of also applying that same logic to the physical aspects of playing. In a lesson, he would take his mouthpiece and say, you know, it's not really about where you put this thing, and he would kind of plant it all over his face and make a good buzz in the thing, trying to get you away from feeling like if you didn't have that mouthpiece in exactly the right place, and if you weren't using the smallest, tiniest muscle groups that you really had no control over in order to take care of the craft of what you were doing. He wanted to get you away from that. Yeah. Get out of your own way as a player and be that musician. I even in the few lessons that I took with him, it must have made such a huge impact on me at the time, because as I said before, it really did completely turned my thought process around as a player and a teacher. And I can look back over the years to a whole studio full of students that I feel like that approach was successful with.
Yeah, for sure. I think you had mentioned off camera the idea of the craft and then the art, the craft being the pedestal. Maybe you'd like to...
Sure. I use a lot of analogies in my own teaching, and one of them is to think of what we do as like a statue in the park. Maybe a statue of a Civil War general on a horse. The bottom of that statue is the pedestal. It's a big square hunk of concrete that basically forms the important elements that hold up that statue, the fundamentals of what we do.
Mm-hmm.
But the statue is of something that was living, that has to have life, that has to look like it was living. And that's, to me, what we do as players. We've got to have those good fundamentals, but then we apply it. The person who created that statue, the sculptor or artist, does not want people to come to look at that pedestal.
Right.
They want them to look at the statue,
Exactly.
and that the pedestal is there to raise it up so that all can see it more
Right.
clearly. That's
Yeah.
what we do.
That's exactly it. And I think the lasting remark that you mentioned, John, you're not having any fun. That remark is so deep because it wasn't just an observation, but it was a way to get you to change your thinking
Yes.
and to put your thinking in that place where you're going to be a communicator, not an evaluator.
Exactly. Absolutely. Perfectly said.
Oh, well, we probably should stop there then, but we're not going to stop just yet. Don't stop. I'm not sure exactly where we were when the camera stopped, but thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank Christian Griego for letting us use his shop here in Delavan, Wisconsin. It was a great save on his part to help this interview take place. So thank you, Kristen. It's great. And of course, Puddles wanted me to give you, John, this wonderful token of art. Well, we hope it's wonderful. Token of art Thanksgiving that you would come all the way from Madison to be with us. A genuine Tube of People TV water bottle. And
Thank you, Mark.
And Puddles, also wanted me to communicate that he realizes that it's no small concession on your part for him to appear in the frame with you, being a Badger for 30 years or so.
That's okay. Puddles is very important to you, so that's fine with me. If I was here in your shoes, I would probably want Bucky to be up there.
There
so
you go.
I have to be, magnanimous.
And we do wish the Badgers all the best in their upcoming bowl game.
Thanks very much. Interestingly enough for me, before I came to Wisconsin, I taught for 4 years at the University of Miami. So my two schools where I taught are meeting each other here. Now I have nearly 30 years at Wisconsin, so I have to go with the Badgers for this one.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. It's been a great pleasure to talk about somebody who not only meant something to me, but who meant so much to all of us in our end of the business.
And now back to you.